It was marvellous to get back to my husband, Norm. Oh, dear, just the same, of course. It was such a pity he couldn't have come on the trip with me, but there it was. You see, we sold this block of land, the Melbourne suburb of Sunshine, to make it possible, and, you know, it only seems yesterday that Norm and I were going through all the pros and cons, finance-wise, on the kitchen table, on the dining room table. And quite soon, you know, after adding up a few facts and figures, Norm realised that one of us would have to make a big sacrifice. Anyway, next day I went down to get my ticket.
This programme looks at the years 1950 to 1965. It looks at the ways Australia still functions as a kind of detached part of Britain, run on second-hand British assumptions, and still officially monocultural. The title, Axminster Democracy, comes from the English Axminster weave carpets, found in many houses, symbolising the promise of increasingly accessible comfort, which would unfold as the 50s progressed. Nevertheless, there were forces working for change in the community, forces much greater than was realised at the time. After World War II, much of colonial Asia was on the verge of independence. China was in the throes of a civil war, which the communists won in 1949. Australia's traditional fear, the Yellow Peril, had suddenly become the Red Menace.
In recent years, a sinister force has appeared in our world. Its leader and its army preach a new gospel, the gospel of materialism, with a greed that denies God and says that you, the individual, has no soul and no human rights. That sinister force is communism.
Australia's empty spaces seemed vulnerable once more. The task was to try and fill them, or at least boost Australia's population. Then, just 7 million, it needed speedy reinforcement. Arthur Caldwell, the Minister for Immigration in the post-war Chifley government, dreamt of 20 to 30 million people living in Australia within a generation. He set in place a large-scale migration scheme.
We've got so many people around the world now wanting to come to Australia that if they all came here, well, we just wouldn't know where to house them, and we'd complicate our economy. But we can take them all in due course, and we'll take them as we get ships for them. We can't get all the ships we want, but our prospects are improving. I think we'll get an aircraft carrier to bring people here.
There were to be no Asian immigrants at all. That fear was primal. Europe was to be the source of what would be known as New Australians.
With British shipping reopening the sea lanes, the liner Orion on her first peacetime voyage brings a party of British tradesmen to help the Commonwealth rebuilding programme. The boys are met by the Minister of Immigration and Information, the Honourable A.A. Caldwell, who points out Sydney's views. Fine types of workers who have come to help an empire mission. Fruit's plentiful here, lad, and the band can play of the roast beef of old England without making your mouth water in vain. Some step among strangers. Some were here previously on war service, while others meet loved ones. The Minister for Migration congratulates an engaged couple, then welcomes the whole party.
You are very welcome as new Australians in our Australian community. We want to see more of your type coming to these shores to help to build up the homes that Australians want and that you yourselves will want too later on.
I think Caldwell is a very interesting man, and he was very conscious that what he was doing was not a short-term thing. He knew that this was part of long-term Australian development. He would say, and you can go to Hansard and read his words and say, one day people will come back to what we did, the social experiment that we began. We will create this paradise of people from different backgrounds who can live together in one land because we treat them as equals at the point at which they arrive. And that was something very special about our immigration program. Because it was an agreement between the unions, government and business, people who came here had to have access to the same range of benefits. Therefore, the kind of country you were going to produce was one that was going to show the world how you can make a nation from difference. And Cornwall was conscious of that, clearly conscious that that's what he was contributing to making in this land, as were the ministers in the Liberal government who continued after him.
Cornwall had achieved some notoriety in the previous Labour government by pushing the White Australia policy, and I think Cornwall did this because he was easing the rules about European migration, and he felt that the unions and the working class had to be reassured that not everything was going to be sold out. But again, the transition between 1949, when Menzies came to office, and 1966, when he went, is one in which Asians are starting to be admitted under some circumstances, and where the dictation test has been quietly scrapped. But it's all been done with a minimum of fuss so as not to create a backlash. I suppose that's good politics.
Throughout the Menzies period, all British people had to do was find £10, about a tenth of the boat fare, and the Australian government would find the rest. It was an old tradition, the colonies as the lungs of empire, providing living room for the lower classes. By 1956, 1 million migrants had come to Australia in just 7 years. There was concern to keep the intake 50% British, a goal rarely achieved. When the magical millionth person arrived, matters were arranged so that she would be a British housewife. Many Australians still had relatives in the UK, so the public was urged to bring out a Briton.
Today, throughout Australia, committees are being formed to promote United Kingdom migration. These committees are the very basis of the Bring Out a Britain campaign. What I want you to do in your town is to see that a committee is formed and then to do everything you can to help it.
It is natural that a British country like Australia should seek as many British migrants as possible and give opportunity to as many British people as possible to migrate to this country.
We came here from Britain 3 years ago. We are so very happy that we are bringing out another British family to give them the same chance we got.
Off you go now. Don't be late. Bye, Mummy. Bye-bye. Bye.
These are the people we want, and the more of them, the better. These are the kids, eager to grow up as proud Australians in this great land of ours.
So when Menzies comes into power, I mean, his first instinct is to stem the diversity that the immigration program that Cornwall had started was bringing into the land. He wanted to go back to the source. He wanted to go back to British immigrants. But what he was faced with was the fact that Britain didn't want to let go of its own young people to come to the country. It needed them itself for its own restructuring. So the numbers kind of crashed down to something like, 50,000. So then Menzies just washed his hands of it because our target was always 1% growth through immigration. That's been a constant target. So he just handed over the program to his ministers, to people like Holt, and then took no interest in the immigration program after that point. And it was other visionaries who we don't speak much of, like Holt, who continued expanding the sources of our immigration, always with the sense that those people who would come from lands other than England would make better settlers insofar as they couldn't go back as easily. They'd stay committed. The British would come on assisted passage because they were favoured, obviously, and they had assistance to come here. They'd spend their 2 years here and go back. So they were expensive. They had more adjustment problems because they imagined Australia was going to be like England and they would maintain their rights, and they found that didn't happen. So they were less comfortably part of the land than your German or your Italian or your other person who was grateful for the opportunity to restart their life in a new land and didn't have that same access to returning. So the program became more and more diverse under the ministers that were in the Menzies government.
The British migrants kept coming, attracted by the sunshine and the prospect of a better life as Australia entered the long boom. Most dramatic was the difference in housing.
When British migrants come here in the late 1940s and the 1950s, they're leaving a society where most of them were tenants, usually in council-owned housing, whether they're coming from Scotland or England. They come to Australia with the prospect of owning their own home on their own block of land. It's a revolutionary prospect for them, and most of them adopt it, certainly by the mid-1960s. The demand for home ownership in Australia was extraordinarily great. You get an unbelievable subdivision boom in every Australian city, but particularly in Sydney and Melbourne.
Developments varied. Sometimes whole new towns sprang up, such as Elizabeth outside Adelaide. A satellite town named specially after the Queen, English migrants seemed to find that reassuring, settling there to such an extent that the place was nicknamed Pommy Town. Also new to migrants would have been the household goods, which increasingly filled these homes. While many of the best carpets were an Axminster weave from England, most appliances were locally made.
In the interwar years, Australians, particularly Australian housewives, were bombarded with newspaper and magazine ads for the new consumer appliances. But most of these appliances in Australia don't really become readily available till the 40s and 50s, by which time we're manufacturing a lot of them here. We have a boom in the white goods industry. The federal government, both Labor and Liberal, protects the industry behind high tariff walls, and towns like Elizabeth outside Adelaide grow up to cater for this new consumer demand.
Many migrants worked in the factories where these goods were produced. They guaranteed jobs, as well as an enhanced lifestyle. Most important of all was the car.
One of Australia's newest industrial centres is Fisherman's Bend near Melbourne. Not so many years ago, a swamp. Now the centre of manufacture of Australia's first produced motor car, the Holden. Prime Minister Mr. Chifley is one of the first to inspect the completed model. The car whose
I think General Motors are absolutely marvellous, thank you. I think they're gorgeous. I mean, letting us call it Australia's own car. They didn't have to do that. Such a wonderful gesture.
In the mid-1940s, the federal Labor government decides that we ought to have a car industry of our own. So it puts it out to tender, and both British and American car manufacturing firms bid, and an American firm, General Motors, with Holden's as a local base, wins. It's largely because America has a reputation now for mass production, and British industry is generally thought to be pretty decrepit. This has extraordinary implications for our relationship with Britain, because Britain no longer plays a leading role in our car industry, and British cars become sort of residual imports on our roads, and the big British car names like Austin disappear gradually from car dealerships and the landscape.
The family car, and with it the Sunday drive, were symbols of a new material prosperity. Income seemed more evenly distributed in the 1950s than ever before. English arrivals were struck by the relatively classless, easy-going lifestyle that prevailed in Australia. There was virtually no unemployment. British migrants did not have to take out citizenship, but they soon found out that while prosperity might be possible in the Axminster democracy, voting was compulsory. Nevertheless, Australian society was not without its tensions.
After a struggle, police and security men, they have a job to do. Get the stairway back to the Constellation, and Mrs. Petroff goes aboard.
The Cold War enabled Menzies to tar Labour with the communist brush, while the foundation of the splinter Democratic Labour Party, fiercely anti-communist, pointed to the powerful influence of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Archbishop of Melbourne, until his death in 1963, was still Daniel Mannix. Almost 50 years before, he had campaigned against conscription during World War I. Echoes of that old cleavage, Protestant and Empire Loyalist on one side, and Catholic, Irish and Australia First on the other, were still there. They helped ensure that this religious difference was still the biggest divide in 50s Australia.
There used to be a program called the Catholic Hour, which was on commercial radio. And it was ushered in grandly by the Trumpet Voluntary. At the end, there was a segment called Question Box, which, as a kid, conjured up for me something big and heavy and with a lock. Because Protestants used to write in and ask questions about Catholicism, and the format of the program echoed the gulf that still survived at this time. Question. Answer.
You know the big hill at Campbelltown with the convent of the Good Samaritan right up on the top there? There's no doubt about them, is there? They always pick the best position! They're running the country as far as I can see. Mind you, some of my best friends.
The churches were still powerful and helped sustain the status quo.
Censorship was common and ranked only with Ireland and South Africa in the Western world. It affected everything. Films, books, even comic strips. Barry Humphrey's Bazza Mackenzie could not get past customs because of its wicked swearing. It was a time without pluralism. In Victoria, the Chief Secretary banned a serious novel because he did not wish it read by his teenage daughter.
Non-British migrants were regarded as being all right, so long as they stuck to recognised occupations, such as running the local fruit shop. Otherwise, few concessions were made. Espresso machines and gelati took a long time to get established. Most Australians best use spaghetti as something from a tin served on toast. For a long time, newspapers carried complaints about migrants talking in their own language on public transport.
In migrant communities, schools have been established, and even when a newcomer leaves school, his or her training may continue. A teacher of English is available wherever 6 or more migrants can be brought together. New Australians living in places too far removed from schools are encouraged to enroll as correspondence students. Specially prepared lessons are posted to them so that they too may quickly learn the language they will need to know. Whether in the faraway timberlands or in the cities, radio lessons twice weekly bring further instruction in the language.
The assumption seemed to be that Australia could take in these people and remain the same. Why should it change? There was still a strong British-derived sense of superiority.
There were two programs. One was the assimilation program and one was the conditioning program. As much money was invested as one and the other. The assimilation program, I argue, was for the mainstream population. It wasn't for immigrants. It was to show that we're trying really hard to make sure that these people fit in. And it was essentially about access to resources for those immigrants. And one way of making them feel comfortable was exactly like today. You allowed them to put on their ethnic gear, bring out their ethnic food, and share their customs with you. That was part of the assimilation story. That was part of it. On the other hand, there was this conditioning campaign which told the people back home, whose neighbourhoods were changing around them, that don't worry, these people are really nice people, they're going to really mix in. And a lot of money was spent on that through the Women's Weekly, through television programs, to condition a racist population, an anxious population. Remember, they've just kind of turned in on themselves to accept that people from other lands will benefit them as well as be given a chance to reach their potential in this land.
As for the migrants, so for Aborigines. The assimilationist ideal, the suburbanisation of everybody, was never stronger than in the 50s. On the false assumption that their race was dying out, black children taken from their parents were placed with white families in the cities.
Sleep tight, children, because you know that dreams do come true, don't you?
Those who remained with their own people grew up to a bleak inheritance. Aborigines were not included in the census, did not have the vote, and in some states required a permit to travel. Life expectancy was low and disease rife. There was also malnutrition. People were shocked by this film taken in the late 50s. It was used to help the cause of Aboriginal advancement gain popular support. Meanwhile, whites were taking to the paintings of Albert Namatjira, not least because his watercolors seemed to cover an alien landscape with a blanket of familiarity. The thing which made it easier to discount other Europeans and not count Aborigines at all was that most Australians still thought of their country as British. Legally, we were British subjects and Australian citizens. Passports in the Menzies era proudly proclaimed the former rather than the latter. British honours were still important.
If you're looking at Menzies himself, to some extent he had the same characteristic as Bob Hawke, but I suspect he wanted to be Prime Minister rather than to do anything specific with it. For him, Britain occupied a strong place in his emotions, and I believe the reason for this was that, like many other people of his generation, he didn't think that Australian society had been around long enough to absorb the customs, the adaptations, the traditions which you need to hold a society together. I think he had a profound belief in the law as important and the continuity of tradition, and the only way you could get that continuity in a settler society like that was to attach yourself profoundly emotionally to the historical roots, which of course lay in the British Isles for that generation.
Much of the social infrastructure was still British. Half the population claimed to be Church of England. Until 1961, doctors were members not of the AMA, but of the Australian branches of the BMA, the British Medical Association. England was seen as the ultimate guarantor of standards. It was normal for an Australian who had graduated with first-class honours to sail away to Oxford or Cambridge and do an undergraduate degree all over again.
In the 1950s, the English tradition, as you saw it in Australia, would have been the kind of thing that you would have found in England in about the 1920s. The English public schools had changed quite considerably since then and had loosened up in a way in which the Australian schools hadn't. I think it was not until the late 50s or 60s that the Australian independent public schools tended to catch up with what was going on in England. A very well-known textbook written by Smith, Stanley and Shaw's, called The Foundations of Education, was published in 1950 and became a standard text for Australia in the university courses on education. And so we got direct from America this kind of influence on the design of curriculum. I think I was the one who started the first curriculum course of this kind by teaching it at Sydney and using this new book and other American books that were doing the same kind of thing. And then it became commonplace to do this.
Theatre was still astonishingly British.
A new era, marked by the opening in Sydney of the Elizabethan Theatre. A glittering capacity first night, eager to see a world-famed cast in Terence Rattigan's Sleeping Prince.
Your Imperial and Royal Highness is probably wondering
The first proposal for an Australian National Theatre, prepared by Tyrone Guthrie in the late 40s, envisaged its location not in Australia, but in London. This did not happen. The extraordinary popularity of Summer of the 17th Doll a few years later pointed the way to the vernacular theatre that would emerge in the late 60s.
Gilbert and Sullivan was still popular, and it was really one of the cornerstones of a middle-brow culture that went right through the British Empire, wherever it spread. In Australia, there were touring companies who put on seasons of nothing else. And the British copyright holders were quite happy to allow it to be put on in schools at reduced rates, because they realised it was part of the assertion of a general Britishry. And it was very popular. It was put on in lots of schools, public schools, private schools, state schools. And often, boy sopranos would be a bit pissed off to find themselves conscripted to be in the girls' chorus. There were, of course, American musicals through this time, and they were popular, particularly as film and even occasional professional stage productions. But it wasn't really until the long-playing record had been around for a good while that American musicals became genuinely popular and widespread. And that was the end of the 50s.
We are going to embark.
The great Englishman of the century, the wartime Prime Minister Winston Churchill, was also a pervasive influence. His portrait sat on Victorian Premier Henry Balte's desk. His oratory influenced Menzies. When Churchill died in 1965, a memorial appeal established the Churchill Fellowships. More money was raised in Australia than in England, even though it was England which he had saved during World War II, not Australia. In the Axminster democracy, there was not much protest about the British connection. James McClellan, in 1987, created more of a stir about British nuclear testing in Australia in the 50s than anybody did at the time. People were pleased that Australia could do its bit. The real problem was one of low self-esteem. In 1959, Hollywood actress Ava Gardner came to Australia to make the film On the Beach. Melbourne, she quipped, was the perfect place to make a film about the end of the world. A local journalist had fed her the line. In the 50s and early 60s, Australia did not have much validity as a nation for Australians. Though one of prosperity, it was a conservative time. The tensions of the Cold War reinforced the traditional sense of isolation. American influences were beginning to be felt, but the well-worn paths of the imperial connection were still the norm.
There is no doubt about it whatsoever. There is no doubt that when you go on a trip such as the one I have just returned from,